We wanted to take a deeper look at what happened and what the events of that night can tell us about the reactions to the Trump campaign here in New Mexico, especially among young people who feel isolated by the candidate's statements about women, minorities, and especially immigrants. I'm joined at the table with independent journalist Jeff Proctor. You can find his Justice System Project at newmexicoindepth.org. Also, Emma Sandoval, lead organizer for the Southwest Organizing Project, or SWOP as it's known. And Moises Gonzalez is here. He's an activist, an assistant professor in the UNM Community and Regional Planning Department. Now, Jeff, you've been at past protests here in Albuquerque, including that protest about James Boyd, but going back further, the 2003 protest. I'm curious what you saw in the difference between those protests, between the one 2003 way back at UNM on campus and the one here this week. What's the difference here?
Certainly the police reaction was different. At the Iraq War protests back in 2003, we saw 17 arrests that night. We saw heavy use of tear gas that night. We saw the police using pepper balls, beanbag shotguns, those kinds of things. None of that reaction this time around. I think that it's important to say that one of the big differences in the 13 years between those two events would be the prevalence of cameras. Every protester at the scene on Tuesday night here had a camera of one form or the other. Huge number of media people there as well, not to mention the fact that the police are wearing cameras now themselves. So certainly the camera tends to change behavior. It was also a little bit of a different event in that event back in '03 included a fair bit of marching, sort of back and forth. It was a kind of a movable feast, if you'll pardon the expression. What we saw this last time was probably a larger number of people confined in a smaller space with the target of their ire confined inside a building. So those would be some of the practical and mechanical differences that exist.
Emma, good to see you. Glad you're back. SWOP was part of many other groups who were organizing folks and inviting folks to come protest. What was the goal for SWOP with this protest?
I think the goal was mostly just to give people a space that people could come out and share what they had to say and protest in a safe environment. Our goal was ultimately then to train as many people that we could that were willing to volunteer and put their physical bodies on the line to help keep the environment as safe as possible, to make sure that people weren't hurt and also that weren't arrested. And I feel like our group did a really good job of doing the best that they could to maintain that situation and to support the community and being able to exercise their freedom of speech.
You know, it's interesting, some of the pictures from that night were SWOP folks, volunteers, trained, as you just mentioned, forming a handling chain to protect protesters from police or all the way around, whichever way you want to look at it, but to keep some separation. And my sense of things is SWOP was not getting much credit for trying to be sort of a mollifying factor in the whole thing, but it almost seems like you guys are getting blamed for a lot of the stuff there. What's been the reaction inside SWOP to that?
I think, our organization is set up and primed in a space where we're able to take the grenade for people sometime. I ultimately don't think that this is the outcome was our fault. And I definitely think that we did the best that we could in the instance. And I just had to give so much props and respect for the people that volunteered their time, and not just from SWOP, from other organizations that came out to put their physical bodies in harm's way in order to make sure that people were safe. It was a task. It was a very hard job, and there was people who had things thrown at them and were being hit in the back with billy clubs as things were being moved, and they did a really good job of keeping calm, keeping patience, and trying to help everybody that they could. And I just think that ultimately Donald Trump kind of came in and lit the fire and then watched it burn. So we all had to kind of scramble to say, who's going to take blame for this? So I think that's, it's okay if people want to blame our organization. But if we weren't there, I think that the situation could have been a lot more dangerous.
That's fair to say. Moises, good to see you. Glad you're here with us. Let me read you a quote from City Council President Dan Lewis. Emma just mentioned something interesting. The quote, one of his quotes was, "You can't bring the gas and the matches to the party, then act shocked when a fire erupts." And that begs the question, which is the gas and which is the fire? Does Donald Trump assume some one or the other, either the gas or the fire here?
You know, that's the thing is Donald Trump has been getting away with this radical rhetoric. And this radical rhetoric is based in real, you know, what it does is hit the Chicano, Mexicano, Native American community really hard. Because what we're dealing with is we're dealing with a two-tier colonial process. The Spanish colonial process and the American process. I mean, there's families in New Mexico can go in their closets and find deeds where Thomas Catron robbed them of their land. There's, you know, this narrative that we have here is that the border crossed us, we didn't cross the border. So when you, in any place in the United States where we're the home of Popé and the home of Tijerina, you bring that sort of narrative here, and it strikes me that Dan Lewis, as a city councilor, you know, that should represent the broadest interests of New Mexico, might not have a clue about where, you know, the history of New Mexico. And I would, you know, encourage him to maybe read a little bit about the history of New Mexico to understand where, you know, the reason why people showed up and why there were so many Native American elders and so many Native American people that, you know, the Trump protesters were going to their face and saying, go back to Mexico. Wow. So, I mean, this is the kind of, you know, folks felt very important to be part of some way to stand up for who they are and, and their history and their culture. And this counter narrative to saying, you know, we belong here.
Good point there. Context is what Moises is talking about. Context is important. Also, I have to imagine for reporters reporting on situations like this. Is that important to be able to do that, Jeff, in your view?
It is, and Moises takes it a pretty long way back and lays a really broad base for what some of the context is. And if you look at things from a little more modern perspective, with that as the bedrock in mind, you've got a situation here where a lot of the rhetoric that Trump has used on the campaign trail is very, very personal for people here, as Moises was just saying. And so people talk about, when did this thing turn? It turned when he announced the rally. That was the moment that things began to build and get a little bit hot. And context is also important to remember that, as I was describing before, the ire of these people who came out to exercise their First Amendment rights is inside this convention center. And rather than being able to confront that directly, they were confronted themselves with what is, for a lot of people in these communities, a pretty familiar foe, which is the Albuquerque Police Department. There are still some pretty serious trust issues that exist between the police and certain segments of the community here. Some of that is justified and well-deserved. And I will also say that by and large, save a couple of maybe questionable tactical decisions or some of the individualized incidents we saw, that the police response largely was pretty professional to this. They had a number of opportunities where I think APD in the past may have reacted differently. You could see some command level folks on the scene trying to adjust and make decisions on the fly. Some of the protesters and organizers who I was hanging out with during the protest who saw that happening were sort of encouraged by seeing a little bit of a different police response to the way things were happening. That said, I think there's an expectation among some of the powerful people in the city that the protesters themselves would adhere to some type of professionalism. And while it's not okay to throw rocks and flaming t-shirts at police officers, there is no professionalism requirement in the First Amendment.
That's a good point. Emma, let's take it inside. You were inside the hall, along Javier Benavides, your boss, was infamously now let out. The first one, actually, I think the first one out of the protest. Take us in, your sense of the room, though. Was it full to the brim? Was it angry? Was it, what happened there when you were involved with that?
It was definitely terrifying. We were one of the first people in line purposely, because we were trying to get as close as possible. We ended up right behind Donald Trump speaking, and it was really nerve-wracking. The people there were, you know, I find it funny that people had such high expectations of what the protesters should be doing outside, but the things that people were saying, just standing in line about, like, if I see a protester, I'm gonna punch them in the back of the head, and like people coming out and saying, if you see a protester, tell somebody right away so we can deal with it. And like, you know, it was scary. It was really intimidating. I seen also a lot of profiling that was happening. People that were in like large groups, people of color, particularly young people of color, were being come in, like the security worker coming and talking to them and saying like, "What's your loyalty to Donald Trump? Like, why
Seriously?
are you here?"
Really?
Yeah, and so we were really, really, I think, nervous being in there. And unless, I think more so, we had a plan. We knew that we were going to potentially risk arrest.
Sure.
And I think we were way more afraid of being beat up by the protesters or by the people inside of the rally than we were of the police.
Did you feel like Mr. Trump sort of egged that on a little bit?
He definitely did. They, some of the things that he said after we left, and while we were leaving, and even before, it was set up immediately, saying we respect everybody's First Amendment right, but we also, Donald Trump also respects everybody's Second Amendment right. That's like the first thing they said. So he's basically saying we respect your right to freedom of speech, but we also respect our right to pack heat. And that's pretty scary. It's pretty intimidating. Pretty scary message to put out to people, right? So it was really intimidating, but it was also really powerful and exciting. I think 8 groups in total disrupted him, 8 different times, including ours. And then it was really exciting to see that there was so many people that were willing to take that risk to make sure that he was known, that our voices were heard, and that he was able to hear that New Mexico wasn't going to allow for hate to happen here.
Moises, let me back up a little bit on something you had mentioned earlier, Native and Hispanic youth and empowerment.
Yes.
And it just seems to me what I witnessed was, and what folks don't seem to be getting who have a problem with it, folks want a more professional approach to protesting. It seems to me kids are saying, how's that working out for you? A kid looks around and says, I don't see the result of that, of using that system. Can we not? We can't blame young people for wanting to try another way, can we?
Well, there's a lot of frustration in New Mexico. Let's look at our current context. Let's look at the high unemployment rate.
Right.
Let's look at lack of access to education. Basically at the university, kids graduate and they leave the state to get a job. So when we have, this Trump coming in and creating this narrative, then we have a set of conditions locally that, that with the relationship and this past relationship with police and with the DOJ, the economic conditions of what they are, then you hear this, I'm not even welcome in my own home. I'm not even welcome. I'm seen as a foreigner in my land. When young folks are saying, I didn't jump the border, the border jumped me. And so, or crossed me. And so what we're seeing is this frustration and, and so what I think might be an opportunity, we know Trump's gonna come back. He's going to be the nominee. He'll be back, let's say, I think in October, maybe before that.
Sure.
What I would like, and I think SWAP did an excellent job. In fact, Dan Lewis should be thanking you for the great job that you did to restrain a lot of folks. And so what I would like to see is, the progressive community come together. Maybe there's 2 or 3 or 5 of those activists, those not even activists, folks that got angry and got disruptive. But what if we can reach 50, 75% of them and bring them with the fold and have mentorship. I had some great mentors when I was 18 and getting into being a Chicano activist. Right. But the difference is I had that mentorship. So if we can create those mentorship opportunities, those teach-ins, hopefully the progressive community, we could start working now and doing, having some creative avenues. Right. So when this does happen, we'll create this situation. I hope the police can learn something, or whoever designed. I had a personal family that were on the Trump side going into the rally. I mean, that's just the way it is. I didn't like being put in that situation. Right. I didn't like my own family and us looking at each other and having that awkward moment.
Right.
So those are some thoughts that I've had.
Let me ask you another one too. The use of the Mexican flag by Fox News especially and others. I seem to recall, unless I missed something, I saw maybe 2 flags. Maybe maybe I missed a whole bunch of others. But this idea of using the Mexican flag as some kind of cudgel against people, do you know what I mean? It's some kind of sign that New Mexico is out of control, or do you know what I mean? How should we internalize
Well,
those,
first
those
of all,
kind
I
of
put
things?
some on my Facebook page. I put the seal of New Mexico. No one ever looks at the seal. The seal of New Mexico has an American eagle over the Mexican eagle, the same eagle that's on the Mexican flag. Yeah. And when we think about that, in symbolism of New Mexico, the Mexican eagle's always been used. It's funny when we have Cinco de Mayo, anyone could pop a Mexican flag, but after Cinco de Mayo, it's not cool.
That's right. Yeah.
And so, we can wear sombreros and have a margarita, and it could be all over Budweiser advertisements. But what I think is complex and in not looking at the deep roots of New Mexico, we forget that, the myth that's on the flag. The myth of the flag is when the Aztecs left New Mexico, and they think it's in New Mexico, or the Southwest, let's say, went to Mexico and established their roots. So, when we think about this history and this migration, it's, the Mexican flag in itself is an indigenous symbol about migration, right? And so all of a sudden, it's cool if sorority kids can have the flag in Cinco de Mayo, but you put a young youth holding it on as a symbol of his indigenous identity.
If a face is covered, forget about it.
And if we take that symbol and craze it like this is about my historic roots, and the narrative is transformed, and that's what the folks from Fox will never get.
Interesting point there. Speaking of Fox and other national type outlets, we are at the mercy sometimes of how people portray us, and there's nothing we can necessarily do about it. CNN was on the ground, they had cameras all over the place, certainly, and America got to watch it, the whole thing going live. How should we here locally internalize national news coverage of this? Are we being treated fairly in your view, or is this on the ground reporting just as accurate as it could be from anybody else at this point?
Well, there is something to be said for observational real-time reporting. I know there's a lot of resentment and people are displeased that certain parts of this were shown in the way they were. That said, I mean, that is a real representation of part of what happened here on Tuesday night. The job of the news media is to take that part and place it in the broader context and really try to think through ways to frame these kinds of stories. Framing really, really matters. And what I think a lot of the national coverage missed here is an understanding of what New Mexico is. Why are people upset here? Who are the people here? What are the historical context that this exists in? What is the relationship between this city's police department and the people who are protesting? So those things really, really matter. That said, you end up in a situation where the national media here is here to cover a political story. These are people who've been on the campaign trail with Donald Trump. They don't really understand New Mexico all that well. And if they do, they're here to do a different job. And some of that is a broader and larger critique about the contraction of journalism and the news media through the years. The contextual stuff, especially on the fly, that's harder work. It's difficult to keep people in our industry who are capable of and willing to do that kind of work. But no, I don't think we were treated particularly fairly by the nationals, and I think there was some local coverage that I think missed the mark quite a bit as well. That said, I think there were some local journalists who really did a good job of trying to separate the different elements of what it was that took place here. So I think it was a mixed bag in terms of what the coverage looked like.
Emma, let me finish with you. What do you want the community to know about what the overall intent, goal, result, all that stuff about this protest? There's got to be a takeaway. There's got to be something positive, I would think, for SWAP at this point. What do you think that is for folks out there?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that people are recognizing that Donald Trump's hate rhetoric is very dangerous. It's very, it incites emotion within people that it's really hard to control or to have patience to kindly explain to somebody why it's wrong. And so for us, it's really, what we took away really was that we are best when we are united, when we stand on a front together, and when we tell the community that we are not going to be tolerant of hate inside of our city, inside of our community, and that's why Donald Trump is not welcome in New Mexico, because we are not tolerant.
Well, as Moises says, he'll be back, and we'll see what happens next time. Moises Gonzalez, Emma Sandoval, Jeff Proctor, thank you guys for coming in. Really appreciate it. Busy week. Thank you all for sparing some time for us.